Summer 1942, Eastern Front. A German infantry Unteroffizier named Klaus Behren crouched in a shallow trench outside Voronezh, watching Soviet T-34 tanks roll toward his position with the inevitability of a steel tide. He held a standard-issue Kar 98K rifle, 5 rounds in the magazine, against 30 tons of armour moving at 30 miles per hour. The mathematics of his survival were simple and horrifying. He had no chance. This scene repeated itself thousands of times across the Eastern Front in 1942 and early 1943. German infantry, the best trained soldiers in the world, veterans of Poland, France, and 2 years of brutal combat in Russia, found themselves helplessly watching enemy armour approach. Their anti-tank rifles, designed to defeat tanks from the previous war, bounced off T-34 armour like pebbles off concrete. The towed Pak-36 anti-tank guns, effective in 1940, were now bitter jokes. Soldiers called them door knockers. They knocked on tank armour but couldn't get in. The appearance of the T-34 in summer 1941 had shocked the Wehrmacht to its core. German tank crews who had swept across Europe in Panzer IIIs and IVs suddenly faced a Soviet medium tank that was faster, better armoured, more powerfully armed, and mechanically superior to anything in the German arsenal. By 1942, the flood of Soviet armour threatened to drown the German army in steel. In Leipzig, Germany, far from the frozen hell of the Russian front, an engineer named Dr. Heinrich Langweiler sat in his office at Hugo Schneider Aktiengesellschaft, known as HASAG, staring at an impossible problem. The German High Command had given him a directive that seemed to contradict every principle of weapons development. Create an anti-tank weapon that could be produced by the millions, used by untrained soldiers, fired once and thrown away, yet powerful enough to destroy any tank in existence, and do it in months, not years. Langweiler's team began work in summer 1942 on what they initially called Gretchen, Little Greta. The concept was revolutionary in its simplicity. A recoilless gun principle, where propellant gases vented equally forward and backward, eliminating recoil. A shaped charge warhead that focused explosive energy into a jet of superheated metal capable of penetrating massive armour. A disposable launch tube made from cheap low-grade steel. No sophisticated aiming system, no complex trigger mechanism, just point and shoot. The prototype that emerged in early 1943 looked less like a weapon and more like an oversized firecracker. The Faust Patron, fist cartridge, consisted of a simple steel tube 33 centimeters long containing 54 grams of black powder. The warhead, a bulbous 10 centimeter diameter shaped charge containing 400 grams of explosive, protruded from the muzzle like a grotesque mushroom. The thing weighed just over 7 pounds. It had no safety mechanism beyond a simple pin. The sight was a crude metal blade welded to the tube. Effective range was listed optimistically as 30 meters, less than 100 feet. You had to get close enough to see the tank commander's face before you could kill him. Initial tests at the HASAG Proving Grounds produced results that seemed too good to be true. The shaped charge warhead, using a 50-50 mix of TNT and hexagen, punched through 140 millimeters of armor plate. That was enough to penetrate any tank in the world from the side or rear. Even the mighty Soviet KV-1 heavy tank with its 75mm frontal armor was vulnerable. The weapon worked. Now came the hard part, making millions of them. The first 500 Faustpatronen were delivered to units on the Eastern Front in August 1943. German infantrymen, who had spent 2 years feeling helpless against Soviet armor, received these crude tubes with skepticism bordering on contempt. One soldier later recalled his first impression. They gave us hollow pipes with explosives stuck on the end. We thought it was a joke, a sick joke from headquarters that had never faced a T-34. The instructions were absurdly simple. Remove the safety pin. Tuck the tube under your arm at a 45-degree angle to account for the weapon's ballistic arc. Aim using the crude blade sight. Squeeze the firing lever. The black powder charge would ignite, blasting the warhead forward at 30 meters per second while venting flame and smoke from the rear. If you fired from an enclosed space, the backblast would kill you. If you fired from an open trench and didn't keep your mouth open, the overpressure could rupture your lungs. If you missed, you had a single-shot weapon that was now useless against 10 tons of tank churning toward you at 30 miles per hour. If you hit, the shaped charge would detonate on contact, driving a jet of molten copper through the armor at 8,000 meters per second, followed by a spray of spalling metal fragments and superheated gas that would ignite ammunition, fuel, and human beings with equal efficiency. The first confirmed Panzerfaust kill occurred near Smolensk in September 1943. A Soviet T-34 from the 3rd Guards Tank Army was advancing down a village street when Grenadier Otto Schmidt, 19 years old, 6 weeks of infantry training, fired a Faust patron from a basement window at a range of approximately 20 meters. The shaped charge struck the T-34's side armor, penetrated and detonated the ammunition storage. The explosion blew the turret 15 meters into the air. All 5 crew members died instantly. Schmidt survived long enough to report his success before Soviet infantry killed him 3 hours later. Word of the weapon's effectiveness spread through German units with the speed of desperate hope. Soldiers who had cowered in trenches watching Soviet armor pass untouched suddenly had a weapon that gave them a chance, but that chance came at a terrifying price. To use the Panzerfaust effectively, you had to let the tank get within 30 meters. That meant lying in wait while 30 tons of steel rolled toward you, machine guns blazing, supporting infantry searching for anti-tank teams. It meant steadying your nerve while your every instinct screamed to run. It meant holding your position until you could see the rust on the tank's armor, until you could hear the clank of its tracks and the roar of its diesel engine. Then you had one shot, one chance. Miss and you died. Hit and you might still die, but at least you'd take the tank with you. By October 1943, HASAG had improved the design. The new Panzerfaust 30, named for its nominal 30-meter range, featured a larger launch tube, increased propellant charge, and a refined warhead. Weight increased to 11 pounds. The sight improved marginally. The warhead now carried 800 grams of explosive and could penetrate 200 millimeters of armor. But the fundamental bargain remained unchanged. Extreme lethality bought with extreme danger. The statistics from late 1943 began telling a story that German High Command found both encouraging and horrifying. Panzerfaust teams were achieving kills, but at catastrophic casualty rates. For every tank destroyed, an average of 2.3 anti-tank teams were killed. Sometimes the weapon worked, but the operator died in the explosion. Sometimes the tank's accompanying infantry spotted the launch signature and killed the operator before he could escape. Sometimes the destroyed tank was just the first in a column, and the following tanks machine-gunned anyone who had revealed their position. Yet soldiers kept using them because the alternative was worse. Without the Panzerfaust, they had no defense against armor at all. With it, they at least had a chance, however slim. A chance was better than hopelessness. Lieutenant General Vasily Trykov, commanding the Soviet 8th Guards Army, first encountered concentrated Panzerfaust use during the drive toward the Dnieper River in November 1943. His after-action report was terse. New German anti-tank weapon encountered. Single use. Short range. Extremely effective when employed from ambush positions. Our tank losses from this weapon are becoming significant. Recommended countermeasures are additional infantry support for armoured units, and more thorough clearing of defensive positions before tank advance. What Truykov's clinical language didn't convey was the terror these weapons induced in Soviet tank crews. Tankers who had grown confident facing German anti-tank guns, which at least revealed their positions when firing, now faced an enemy that could be anywhere within 30 meters. A basement window, a pile of rubble, a shell crater, a barn. Every potential hiding place became a death trap. Soviet tank commanders began improvising defenses, logs and spare track links welded to hull sides, sandbags piled on engine decks, wire mesh screens mounted on frames to pre-detonate shaped charges before they reached armor. Some of these measures helped marginally. Most added weight without providing meaningful protection. The Panzerfaust's shaped charge didn't care about logs or sandbags. It would detonate the logs, then send its jet of molten metal through the actual armor behind them. By early 1944, production had ramped to staggering numbers. HASAG's facilities at Schlieffen were producing 200,000 Panzerfaust 30s per month, using forced labour from concentration camp prisoners. The weapons were so simple that semi-skilled workers could assemble them with minimal training. Each unit cost approximately 6 Reichsmarks to produce. A Tiger tank cost 800,000 Reichsmarks. For the price of one heavy tank, Germany could produce 133,000 Panzerfausts. The economic logic was inescapable. Germany couldn't match Soviet tank production. The Red Army was building 30,000 tanks per year. Germany managed 20,000 fighting vehicles total, including assault guns and tank destroyers. But Germany could drown the battlefield in disposable anti-tank weapons. If each Panzerfaust destroyed even a fraction of a tank, the math worked out. January 1944 brought the Panzerfaust 60, featuring doubled range through increased propellant charge and a refined launch tube. Now operators could fire from 60 meters, buying precious seconds of standoff distance. The warhead diameter increased to 150 millimeters, carrying 800 grams of explosive. Penetration increased to 200 millimeters at 0 degrees impact angle. Most significantly, the flip-up sight was refined, making aim more accurate. This version also included a revised trigger mechanism that was less prone to accidental discharge. The weapon remained fundamentally the same. One shot, disposable tube, recoilless firing. But those incremental improvements meant the difference between life and death for the soldiers using them. The appearance of the Western Allied invasion of Normandy in June 1944 marked the Panzerfaust's introduction to American and British tankers who found it no less terrifying than their Soviet counterparts. British tank commander Stuart Hills of the Sherwood Rangers Yeomanry recorded his first encounter with a Panzerfaust during the advance into Belgium in September 1944. Hill's Sherman was hit by a Panzerfaust fired from a basement window in the Belgian city of Giel. The shaped charge struck the sponson, penetrated the differential housing, and destroyed half the sprocket assembly. If his co-driver's position had been occupied, that man would have died. Hills wrote later, "The encounter left me with nightmares for decades. The knowledge that death could come from anywhere, at any moment, from a weapon you couldn't see or hear until it had already hit you. It was psychological warfare as much as physical." The bocage country of Normandy proved ideal Panzerfaust terrain. Ancient earthwork hedgerows created natural ambush positions every few dozen meters. German infantry would position themselves in hedgerow gaps, wait for Allied tanks to pass, then fire into the thinner side and rear armour. American tankers quickly learned to never advance down Norman lanes without infantry support. The cost of this education was measured in burning Shermans and cremated crews. Allied intelligence reports from June 1944 began documenting the Panzerfaust's impact. One report from 2nd Armoured Division noted that hollow charge weapons, primarily Panzerfausts, accounted for approximately 13% of tank losses, nearly equal to the combined total from German Panzer IVs, Panthers and Tigers. The weapons were being used in German towns as roadblocks. A single well-positioned Panzerfaust team could disable the lead tank in a column, blocking the entire road and exposing the following vehicles to further attack. But the statistics also revealed the weapon's limitations. Analysis of Panzerfaust strikes showed that 51% hit from the side, 31% from the front, 9.5% from the rear, and 8.5% from above. This wasn't random distribution. It reflected the tactical reality that Panzerfaust teams positioned themselves to target the weakest armour. Frontal hits, while possible, were far less likely to achieve kills due to thicker armour. The weapon also required specific conditions to be effective. Open terrain favoured the tanks, which could maintain standoff distance and use their superior optics to spot anti-tank teams before they got within range. Urban terrain, forests and broken ground favoured the Panzerfaust, providing cover for infiltration and ambush. By autumn 1944, the Panzerfaust 100 entered production. This variant featured a two-stage propellant charge separated by an air gap, providing more sustained acceleration and extending range to 100 meters. The tube diameter increased to 60 millimeters. The weapon now weighed 14 pounds loaded. Penetration remained at 200 millimeters, but accuracy improved significantly. For the first time, Panzerfaust teams could engage from what tankers considered minimum safe distance. The psychological impact was enormous. Allied tank crews had learned that close terrain was dangerous. They'd adapted tactics accordingly, using infantry to clear positions before armour advanced. Now the threat zone had expanded. What was safe yesterday became lethal today. The evolution continued with the Panzerfaust 150, which entered limited production in late 1944. This variant featured a reinforced tube designed for multiple uses, a streamlined warhead, and a sophisticated propellant system. Initial production runs of 100,000 units were completed, though combat use was limited. The weapon represented the culmination of Panzerfaust development. The intended range of 150 meters would have made it effective in almost any combat situation. But by late 1944, Germany was running out of everything except desperation. The Battle of Berlin in April and May 1945 became the Panzerfaust's defining moment. The urban battlefield turned German disadvantage into advantage. Soviet armour couldn't maintain standoff distance in Berlin's narrow streets. Every building was a potential firing position. Every basement window, every pile of rubble, every bombed-out shop, concealed potential anti-tank teams. Soviet Marshal Georgy Zhukov's forces learned this at horrific cost. The Hitler Youth and Volkssturm, poorly trained militias often consisting of teenagers and elderly men, had only minimal combat training. But the Panzerfaust required minimal training. Point the tube, squeeze the lever. The weapon did the rest. The battle in Berlin, as distinct from the larger Battle of Berlin, was fought house to house, room to room, sometimes hand to hand. Soviet combat groups, mixed arms units of about 80 men supported by tanks, moved through the city methodically. German defenders countered with tactics born of desperation and ingenuity. Waffen-SS units positioned machine gunners on upper floors where Soviet tanks couldn't elevate their guns high enough to engage. Simultaneously, they placed Panzerfaust teams in basement windows and ground floor positions to ambush tanks as they moved down streets. The tactics were simple but devastatingly effective. Soviet tanks initially advanced down the centre of streets, making them vulnerable to flanking fire from buildings. The Red Army quickly adapted, moving tanks to hug building walls, providing mutual covering fire. But this made them vulnerable to close-range Panzerfaust attacks from above and behind. The Soviets responded by mounting submachine gunners on tanks to spray every window and doorway, but this prevented rapid turret traverse and made the tanks vulnerable to attack from unexpected angles. The solution was brutal and uncompromising. Soviet forces began using 152mm and 203mm howitzers in direct fire mode to blast defended buildings into rubble. They deployed anti-aircraft guns against German positions on upper floors. Combat groups stopped moving down streets entirely, instead fighting through buildings, blasting holes through walls using captured Panzerfausts, moving through apartments and cellars in enfilading attacks that took German ambush positions in the flank. The French SS volunteers and Hitler Youth attached to the Nordland Division defending Sector C destroyed 14 Soviet tanks with Panzerfausts near Hermannplatz on April 26, 1945. A single machine gun position at the Halensee Bridge held up Soviet advances for 48 hours through a combination of prepared fields of fire and supporting Panzerfaust teams. These were tactical victories that couldn't change strategic reality. By late April, the Nordland Division's armour was reduced to 4 captured Soviet armoured personnel carriers and 2 half-tracks. Their primary weapon was the Panzerfaust, used both against Soviet armour and in house-to-house fighting as an improvised bunker buster. The statistics from urban combat in eastern Germany during the final months of the war tell a stark story. Approximately 70% of tanks destroyed in these battles were hit by Panzerfausts or Panzerschrecks, the larger rocket-propelled anti-tank weapon. This compared to just 6% of British tank losses from Panzerfausts at the Battle of Normandy. The difference was terrain. In Norman Bocage, tanks could still manoeuvre and use standoff tactics. In Berlin's ruins, manoeuvre was impossible. Every tank became a target of opportunity. The human cost was staggering on both sides. Soviet reconnaissance soldier Shuljanok destroyed 3 German assault guns with captured Panzerfausts during a counterattack near the city centre. He was named Hero of the Soviet Union for the feat, then killed the next day by what the citation called a terrorist in civilian clothes, likely a Volkssturm member. The final production numbers defy comprehension. Between August 1943 and May 1945, German industry produced approximately 8.3 million Panzerfausts of all variants. In the final year of the war alone, production exceeded 6 million units. This made the Panzerfaust one of the most produced weapons systems of World War II. The weapons were distributed to every branch of German service: Wehrmacht infantry, Waffen-SS, Luftwaffe ground personnel, Kriegsmarine sailors assigned to shore defence. Even Hitler Youth units received Panzerfausts. Training requirements were minimal. A 30-minute demonstration was considered sufficient. Point, aim, fire, run. Many users received far less instruction. Here's the weapon. That end toward enemy. Squeeze this. Try not to die. In the war's final weeks, German generals made sardonic comments about Volkssturm members armed with nothing but Panzerfausts, suggesting the empty tubes could be used as clubs in hand-to-hand combat. But the joke concealed bitter truth. Germany had created the perfect desperation weapon, cheap enough to produce in millions, simple enough for children and elderly men to use, lethal enough to destroy any tank in the world. It couldn't win the war, nothing could by 1945, but it could make victory cost more Soviet lives, more Allied tanks, more time. It could turn every building, every street corner, every pile of rubble into a potential death trap for armoured vehicles. The Panzerfaust forced Allied armies to develop specific counter-tactics. American and British forces learned to advance armour only with substantial infantry support. Infantry would clear buildings and defensive positions before tanks moved up. Combat engineers would use demolitions to create firing lanes and eliminate ambush positions. Artillery and air support would suppress suspected anti-tank positions before armour committed. Soviet forces developed similar tactics plus improvised armour additions. Tanks sprouted bizarre arrays of logs, spare track links, wire mesh screens, even bed springs welded to hulls in attempts to defeat shaped charge warheads. The logic was sound. If you could make the warhead detonate even 6 inches from actual armour, penetration dropped significantly. Tests at Aberdeen Proving Grounds showed that standoff distance of 12 inches or more reduced penetration by 25 to 30%. But achieving meaningful standoff required frames, projecting 2 to 3 feet from the tank hull, turning already cramped vehicles into ungainly monsters that couldn't fit through bridges or negotiate narrow streets. Most improvised armour was placebo more than protection. The Panzerfaust's impact extended far beyond its combat effectiveness. The weapon represented a fundamental shift in military thinking. Prior to the Panzerfaust, anti-tank weapons were sophisticated, expensive systems requiring significant training. The British 6-pounder gun cost thousands of pounds, weighed over a ton, required a crew of 6, and took months to master. The Panzerfaust cost a few Reichsmarks, weighed 12 pounds, could be used by one person, and required 30 minutes instruction. It was the democratization of anti-tank warfare, the AK-47 of tank killing. Any soldier, regardless of training or physical capability, could destroy the most expensive, sophisticated vehicles on the battlefield. This psychological impact transcended tactical considerations. Tank crews, who had viewed themselves as battlefield elites protected by armour and firepower, suddenly became vulnerable to any enemy soldier within 100 metres. The invulnerability that armour once represented evaporated. A teenage Hitler Youth member with 6 weeks training and a 12-pound disposable tube could kill a Churchill tank that cost £15,000 and required a crew with months of training. The implications were profound and terrifying. The weapon's influence extended into the post-war era, shaping anti-tank weapon development for decades. The American M72 Law, light anti-tank weapon, adopted in 1963, was a direct descendant of the Panzerfaust concept. A disposable tube, a shaped charge warhead, a simple firing mechanism. The Soviet RPG-7, perhaps the most successful anti-tank weapon ever developed, incorporated Panzerfaust principles while adding a rocket booster for extended range. Modern weapons like the 84 and the Swedish M3, the British Law 80, all trace their lineage to Dr. Heinrich Langweiler's desperate creation in a Leipzig office in 1942. The shaped charge principle that made the Panzerfaust lethal remains the basis for infantry anti-tank weapons today. Modern versions are more sophisticated, with tandem warheads to defeat reactive armour, programmable fuses, and guidance systems. But the fundamental concept remains unchanged. A soldier with a disposable tube can destroy a multi-million-dollar main battle tank. The Panzerfaust also influenced tactical doctrine that persists today. The understanding that infantry armed with anti-tank weapons can contest armoured forces in close terrain became foundational to modern combined arms warfare. Tank forces cannot operate independently in built-up or restricted terrain without prohibitive losses. This lesson, learned at terrible cost in Berlin, Normandy, and thousands of smaller engagements, shapes military planning to this day. But the weapon's effectiveness must be understood in context. Post-war analysis showed that while Panzerfausts accounted for significant Allied tank losses, they were far from the dominant killer. A comprehensive study of 12,140 knocked-out Allied tanks from all theatres found that conventional gunfire from anti-tank guns, tank destroyers, and enemy tanks accounted for 54% of losses. Anti-tank mines came second at 20 to 22%. Hollow charge weapons, including both Panzerfausts and the larger Panzerschreck, caused approximately 7.5% of losses overall. However, this figure is misleading because it includes the entire war. When examining only the period from June 1944 onwards, when Panzerfaust distribution became widespread, the percentage rises to 10 to 13%. In Italy during spring 1945, hollow charge weapons claimed 20 to 25% of Allied tank casualties. During pursuit operations in Germany in late 1944 and early 1945, when German conventional anti-tank capabilities had largely collapsed, Panzerfaust accounted for 25 to 35% of tank losses. Soviet data tells a more complex story. Reports from various fronts show wildly different effectiveness rates. The Second Ukrainian Front reported in February 1945 that only 2 out of 160 tank casualties, approximately 0.6%, were caused by Faustpatronen. Yet the 2nd Guards Tank Army during the Berlin operation reported that 106 out of 576 disabled vehicles, approximately 18.4%, were Panzerfaust kills. The discrepancy reflects varying tactical situations. In open terrain offensive operations, Panzerfausts were largely irrelevant. Soviet tanks could maintain standoff distance and use their supporting arms to suppress anti-tank positions. In urban combat, where Soviet armour had to advance into close terrain without adequate infantry support, Panzerfaust effectiveness skyrocketed. Colonel General S.I. Bogdanov, commanding the 2nd Guards Tank Army, specifically noted the problem in his reports. Quote, "The infantry fighting alongside the tanks cleared only the lower floors, leaving the others untouched. This allowed Panzerfaust operators and snipers to fire at the tanks." End quote. The weapon exploited poor tactical integration, not technical superiority. The Panzerfaust also influenced civilian perceptions and post-war memory. Iconic photographs of elderly Volkssturm members and teenage Hitler youth armed with Panzerfausts became symbols of Nazi Germany's final desperation. The image of a child soldier with a disposable anti-tank weapon embodied the regime's willingness to sacrifice its own population in a futile attempt to delay the inevitable. These weapons in the hands of barely trained civilians also contributed to the brutality of the war's final phase. Soviet forces, already motivated by revenge for German atrocities in occupied Soviet territory, faced an enemy that couldn't be easily distinguished from civilians. Anyone, regardless of age or appearance, might be carrying a Panzerfaust. This contributed to the Red Army's extremely aggressive, clearing operations in German cities, where assumptions of civilian innocence couldn't be afforded. The Finns, who received 25,000 Panzerfausts from Germany, had mixed experiences with the weapon. Finnish forces expended only 4,000 in combat, suggesting either limited opportunities to use them effectively or dissatisfaction with their performance. Finnish experience suggested the weapon worked well in ambush situations, but was less effective than hoped in fluid combat. The Finnish military's detailed documentation included specific aiming instructions for Soviet T-34 and American Sherman tanks, showing that effective use required understanding of armour layouts and weak points, hit the turret ring, target the engine deck, aim for the lower hull where armour was thinnest. Miss those spots and even a successful hit might not achieve a kill. The weapon's reputation exceeded its actual battlefield impact, a common phenomenon with revolutionary weapons. The Panzerfaust became mythologized by both sides. Germans saw it as a wonder weapon that gave common soldiers the power to defeat enemy armour. Allies saw it as a terrifying threat lurking in every shadow. The reality was more nuanced. The Panzerfaust was an effective infantry anti-tank weapon within its limitations. It gave German forces a capability they desperately needed when conventional anti-tank weapons were insufficient. But it couldn't stop the Allied advance. It couldn't prevent Soviet armies from overwhelming German defences through sheer mass. It couldn't change the fundamental reality that Germany was fighting enemies with superior industrial capacity, larger populations, and ultimately greater staying power. What the Panzerfaust could do was exact a price. Every Allied tank destroyed was several tons of industrial production eliminated. Every tank crew killed was months of training lost. Every advance delayed was more time for Germany to evacuate civilians, relocate valuable personnel, destroy sensitive documents. The weapon was a tactical tool wielded in service of strategic bankruptcy. By May 1945, the Panzerfaust had achieved a strange form of immortality. It had proven that infantry could contest armour on relatively equal terms given the right weapon and terrain. It had demonstrated that simple, disposable weapon systems could be strategically significant. It had shown that desperate circumstances could drive revolutionary innovation. Dr. Heinrich Langweiler's impossible problem, posed in summer 1942, had been solved. He had created a weapon that could be produced by millions, used by untrained soldiers, fired once and discarded, yet destroy any tank in existence. The weapon worked exactly as designed. It just couldn't save Germany from the consequences of its own actions. The Panzerfaust's legacy lives on in every modern infantry anti-tank weapon, the AT-4s used by American forces, the RPG-29s in Russian service, the NLAW systems deployed by British troops, all descend from that. Crude steel tube with a shaped charge warhead that emerged from a Leipzig engineering office in 1943. The principle remains valid. The tactics remain relevant. The lesson endures. In the endless competition between armour and anti-armour, between protection and penetration, between the tank and the soldier on foot with a weapon, the Panzerfaust proved that individual soldiers armed with the right tools could threaten even the most powerful vehicles. That truth, established at terrible cost in the ruins of Berlin, the bocage of Normandy, the forests of the Ardennes, and countless other battlefields, continues to shape military planning and procurement to this day. When Allied tankers emerged from their vehicles after Germany's surrender, when Soviet tank crews finally climbed out of their scarred T-34s and IS-2s, many spoke with grudging respect about the weapon that had terrorized them. It was crude, it was simple, it was cheap. But in the hands of a determined soldier willing to get within 30 meters of a tank, it was absolutely deadly. The Panzerfaust turned Allied armour into burning wrecks not through technological superiority or superior tactics, but through the desperation of soldiers who had no other choice. When your nation is collapsing around you, when enemy armies are closing from all directions, when conventional weapons have failed and defeat seems certain, a 12-pound disposable tube that gives you one chance to destroy a 30-ton tank becomes precious beyond measure. That single shot might kill you, it probably will, but it gives you a chance to fight back, to inflict pain on the enemy, to make your death matter. For German soldiers in 1944 and 1945, faced with overwhelming Allied material superiority, the Panzerfaust offered something more valuable than tactical advantage. It offered hope, however futile. The hope that individual courage and sacrifice could delay the inevitable. The hope that even in defeat they could exact a price. The hope that a single soldier with a simple weapon could stop a tank. Sometimes, that hope proved justified. A shaped charge warhead delivered at the right angle to the right point on a tank's hull could transform 30 tons of steel and explosives into a funeral pyre for its crew. In those moments, the mathematics of desperation validated Dr. Langweiler's design. The Panzerfaust worked. When the weapon was finally laid down in May 1945, when the last disposable tube was discarded in the ruins of Berlin, it had achieved its purpose. Not victory, that was impossible by the time it entered service, but it had given German infantry a tool to contest Allied armour. It had forced Allied armies to adapt their tactics, to advance more slowly, to pay a higher price for every kilometre gained. 8 million Panzerfausts delivered to a collapsing army. Simple weapons for desperate times. The tank fist of a dying regime, reaching out one last time to strike at the Allied steel tide that ultimately drowned it. The weapon couldn't save Germany, but it ensured that the final victory would be written in blood and burning tanks. The psychological impact of the Panzerfaust on Allied tank crews deserves deeper examination, as it fundamentally altered the nature of armoured warfare in ways that persist to this day. Sergeant James Rothwell of the British 7th Armoured Division, the Desert Rats, kept a diary throughout his service from North Africa through Northwest Europe. His entries from 1942 and 1943 reflect the confidence of a man fighting in what he considered an impregnable fortress. Jerry's anti-tank guns are dangerous if you're careless, but you can see them, hear them, avoid them. Inside the tank I feel safe. His entry from September 1944, after his first encounter with a Panzerfaust near Nijmegen, tells a different story. We can't see them, can't hear them. They're everywhere and nowhere. Every window could hide death. every pile of rubble, every shadow. I don't feel safe anymore. None of us do. This transformation from confidence to constant vigilance affected Allied armoured operations at every level. Tank commanders who had previously operated with hatches open for better visibility now buttoned up, sacrificing situational awareness for protection. Crews who had advanced aggressively now moved with extreme caution, stopping to clear every potential firing position. The psychological tax of constant vigilance degraded combat effectiveness even when no Panzerfausts were present. The mere possibility of the weapon's presence was enough to slow advances and complicate operations. Soviet tankers developed their own terminology for the phenomenon. They called it Faustnik fever, a state of hypervigilance that left crews exhausted and prone to errors. Tank commander Mikhail Borisov wrote in his memoirs that by the time his unit reached Berlin, every crew member was jumping at shadows. We saw Panzerfausts everywhere, in every window, every doorway, every pile of bricks. Sometimes we were right, more often we weren't. But you couldn't take chances. The one time you didn't check, that's when they'd get you. The American experience in the Hurtgen forest from September through December 1944 demonstrated the Panzerfaust's effectiveness in the worst possible terrain for armoured operations. The dense forest, with visibility often limited to less than 50 metres, created ideal conditions for ambush. German defenders, including Volksgrenadier divisions hastily formed from Luftwaffe and Kriegsmarine personnel with minimal combat training, nevertheless achieved remarkable success with Panzerfausts against American armour attempting to advance through the forest trails. Lieutenant Paul Birsch of the 2nd Infantry Division recorded that his units supporting Sherman tanks were terrified of the forest. Tankers who had fought across France with reasonable confidence now refused to advance without substantial infantry screening. When they did move, they did so at walking pace, with infantry physically checking every potential firing position before the tanks would advance past it. This reduced American offensive momentum to a crawl, allowing German defenders to hold positions that should have been overwhelmed in hours for days or weeks. The Battle of the Bulge in December 1944 showcased both the Panzerfaust's capabilities and its limitations in large-scale mobile warfare. During the initial German breakthrough, when American units were scattered and disorganized, Panzerfaust teams achieved numerous kills against isolated American armor. At the crossroads town of Bastogne, German forces surrounded the 101st Airborne Division and supporting armored units, creating the close-range conditions where Panzerfausts excelled. But as American forces reorganized and counterattacked, the limitations became apparent. In open-terrain combat during the Allied response, German Panzerfaust teams were largely ineffective. American tank destroyers and artillery could engage from ranges where the Panzerfaust was useless. American tactical air power, when weather permitted, could identify and suppress German infantry positions before they could close to effective range. The weapon that was devastating in the forests around Bastogne became nearly irrelevant in the plains as Allied forces pushed toward the Rhine. This tactical flexibility was something German forces increasingly lacked. By early 1945, the Wehrmacht's conventional anti-tank capabilities had deteriorated to the point where Panzerfausts often represented the only available counter to Allied armour. Towed anti-tank guns required vehicles to move them, and fuel shortages made movement impossible. Self-propelled tank destroyers like the Jagdpanzer and Hetzer were being destroyed faster than they could be replaced. The mighty Panther and Tiger tanks that had terrorized Allied armour in 1943 and 1944 were now rare sights on the battlefield, broken down from mechanical failures or destroyed in combat that German industry could no longer replace. This left the Panzerfaust as the Wehrmacht's primary anti-tank weapon by default rather than design. Units that should have been equipped with a balanced mix of anti-tank capabilities instead relied almost exclusively on disposable tubes carried by infantry. This created a bizarre tactical situation, where German defensive doctrine was built around allowing Allied tanks to close to point-blank range, the exact opposite of conventional anti-tank tactics that emphasized engaging at maximum possible distance. The crossing of the Rhine in March 1945 illustrated this evolution. German defenders on the East Bank, lacking mobile reserves or significant artillery support, were forced to allow American and British forces to establish bridgeheads before engaging. Once Allied armour crossed, Panzerfaust teams would attack from prepared positions in the riverside towns and villages. The tactics achieved local successes, destroying numerous Allied, vehicles, but couldn't prevent the strategic defeat. Allied engineers simply built more bridges, brought over more tanks, and overwhelmed the defenders through mass. General George S. Patton's Third Army encountered concentrated Panzerfaust defences during the drive into Bavaria and Czechoslovakia. Patton's solution was characteristically blunt. He ordered his armour to advance at maximum speed, bypassing fortified towns and villages rather than clearing them systematically. German Panzerfaust teams found themselves outflanked and isolated, unable to engage the fast-moving American columns. When forced to clear defended positions, Patton employed massive artillery bombardments, followed by infantry assaults, only committing armour after positions were thoroughly suppressed. This tactical evolution demonstrated an important lesson. The Panzerfaust was a reactive weapon, most effective when the user could choose the time and place of engagement. Against an enemy willing to pay the price in infantry casualties to suppress anti-tank positions before committing armour, its effectiveness diminished. The weapon gave German infantry the capability to contest Allied armour, but it couldn't provide the initiative needed to defeat mobile operations conducted by an enemy with overwhelming material superiority. The production numbers for the Panzerfaust's final months tell a story of German industrial priorities in the war's dying days. In January 1945, production reached 1.3 million units. February saw 1.4 million produced. March produced another 1.2 million before Allied bombing, and the loss of industrial areas caused production to collapse. In these final months, Germany was producing more Panzerfausts than all other infantry weapons combined. Factories that had once built precision optical instruments were retooled to stamp out launch tubes. Chemical plants that had produced pharmaceuticals now mixed shaped charge explosives. This represented a conscious choice by German leadership. Resources that could have gone to produce ammunition for conventional weapons, spare parts for vehicles, fuel for aircraft, or food for civilians were instead directed toward disposable anti-tank weapons. The logic was grimly sound. Germany was going to lose. That was certain by early 1945, but the Panzerfaust could at least make that loss expensive for the Allies. Each destroyed Allied tank was one less vehicle available for occupation duty. Each killed Allied soldier was one less person to impose the coming defeat. Albert Speer, Reich Minister of Armaments and War Production, later claimed in his memoirs that he opposed the massive Panzerfaust production as a waste of resources. The historical record suggests otherwise. Speer's ministry actively promoted Panzerfaust production, streamlining manufacturing processes and allocating scarce materials to maintain output even as other weapons programs collapsed. The Panzerfaust was simple, cheap, effective, and most importantly, gave German soldiers something to fight with when everything else was gone. The human cost of this decision is impossible to calculate precisely. How many German soldiers died attempting to use Panzerfausts? How many were killed by tank machine guns while positioning for shots? How many were crushed by tanks they wounded but didn't stop? How many died when the buildings they fired from were demolished by Allied artillery? The weapon's one-shot nature meant operators had to expose themselves to get within range, then had no second chance if they missed. This wasn't warfare. This was sanctioned suicide for the dubious privilege of possibly destroying an enemy vehicle. Yet soldiers continued using them because the alternative was worse. Wehrmacht discipline in the final months of the war was enforced through terror. SS and Feldgendarmerie military police roamed rear areas looking for deserters and stragglers. Summary executions were common. Soldiers faced a choice: advance with a Panzerfaust toward enemy tanks and probably die in combat, or retreat and certainly die by hanging from the nearest lamppost with a sign reading, "I was too cowardly to defend the fatherland," around your neck. Given those options, at least combat offered a chance of survival. The forced labour aspect of Panzerfaust production adds another dark chapter to the weapon's history. The Haysag factories employed thousands of concentration camp prisoners, predominantly Jewish women from Poland and Hungary. These prisoners assembled the weapons under horrific conditions, working 12-hour shifts with minimal food, no safety equipment, and brutal punishment for any perceived resistance. The shaped charge explosives were toxic. The metal working produced dangerous particulates, industrial accidents were common, and medical care non-existent. Felicia Caray, a survivor of the Hassag-Skarżysko-Kamienne labor camp, later documented the conditions. Workers' hands were stained yellow from explosive compounds. Respiratory diseases were endemic. women who couldn't maintain production quotas were beaten or shot. The irony was obvious to the prisoners. They were being worked to death producing weapons that might kill Allied soldiers who were trying to liberate them. Some engaged in subtle sabotage, slightly misaligning components or using incorrect propellant charges, though such efforts were dangerous and of limited effectiveness. The ethical implications extend further when considering who was using these weapons in the war's final weeks. Photographs from March and April 1945 show Hitler Youth members, some as young as 12, carrying Panzerfausts in Berlin's defence. These children, indoctrinated since early childhood in Nazi ideology, were fed into the defensive lines with minimal training and no real understanding of their situation. They were told they were defending their homes and families. They weren't told the war was already lost, that their deaths would accomplish nothing beyond delaying the inevitable by hours or days. Soviet soldiers encountering these child soldiers armed with Panzerfausts faced impossible ethical dilemmas. A 13-year-old with a Panzerfaust was just as capable of destroying a tank and killing its crew as an adult. Soviet tankers couldn't afford mercy when that mercy might cost their lives. Yet killing children, even armed enemy children, left psychological scars that veterans carried for decades. Multiple Soviet memoirs reference the horror of these encounters, the necessity of returning fire against targets that should have been in school, not on a battlefield. The use of elderly Volkssturm members presented similar problems. Men in their 60s and 70s, many veterans of World War I, were pressed into service and given Panzerfausts with cursory instruction. They were sent to defend positions with no hope of success, often without supporting weapons, ammunition for follow-up shots, or means of retreat. Nazi propaganda portrayed this as heroic last stands. The reality was state-sanctioned murder of its own elderly population, dressed up as patriotic duty. American forces encountered Volkssturm and Hitler Youth units during the advance into southern Germany and Austria. The US Army's response varied by unit and commander. Some American units, recognizing that these were essentially civilians coerced into combat, accepted surrenders readily and treated prisoners well. Others, having lost friends to Panzerfaust ambushes, were less forgiving. Elderly men and teenagers found carrying weapons were sometimes shot on sight, their status as non-professional soldiers offering no protection. The legal and moral questions raised by these encounters have never been fully resolved. Were these child and elderly soldiers legitimate combatants? They were armed. They were in uniform or armbands. They were under military command, however nominal. International law suggested they were legal targets. Common morality suggested something else entirely. The Panzerfaust, by being simple enough for anyone to use, had inadvertently enabled the Nazi regime's final atrocity, turning its own children and elderly into expendable anti-tank obstacles. The weapon's post-war influence extended into the early Cold War period. Both the United States and Soviet Union captured enormous quantities of Panzerfausts and studied them extensively. American weapons designers at Aberdeen Proving Grounds conducted exhaustive tests on captured examples, firing them at mock-ups of Soviet IS-3 heavy tanks and analysing penetration mechanics. Soviet designers did the same with captured examples and their own tank armour. These studies influenced post-war anti-tank weapon development in multiple ways. The Americans, impressed by the Panzerfaust's simplicity and effectiveness, began development programs that would eventually lead to the M72 law in the 1960s. The Soviets, characteristically, went bigger. Their RPG-2, introduced in 1949, used the Panzerfaust's rickolless principle but added a rocket booster for extended range. This weapon would evolve into the RPG-7, arguably the most successful infantry anti-tank weapon ever developed. The shaped charge principle itself became the focus of intense research. How could tank armour be designed to defeat shaped charge jets? The answer came in multiple forms: spaced armour, where multiple plates separated by air gaps would disrupt the jet; sloped armour, which increased the effective thickness the jet had to penetrate; reactive armour, where explosive plates would detonate outward when struck, disrupting the incoming jet. All of these developments were responses to the Panzerfaust's demonstrated effectiveness. By the 1960s, the tank versus anti-tank pendulum had swung back toward anti-tank weapons. Modern shaped charges could penetrate any practical thickness of conventional armour. The Soviet AT-3 Saga anti-tank guided missile, used devastatingly by Egyptian forces against Israeli armour in the 1973 Yom Kippur War, could destroy any tank from ranges exceeding 3,000 metres. The descendants of the Panzerfaust had evolved from desperate last-ditch weapons to primary anti-armour systems. This evolution forced another revolution in tank design. Composite armour, combining steel, ceramics, and depleted uranium, was developed specifically to defeat shaped charge jets. Active protection systems using radar and small explosive charges to destroy incoming projectiles represented the ultimate defence. Modern main battle tanks are essentially designed around defeating the shaped charge threat that the Panzerfaust first demonstrated at scale. The tactical lessons were equally influential. Modern combined arms doctrine treats infantry as essential for tank operations precisely because of the threat posed by infantry anti-tank weapons. Tanks operating without infantry support in close terrain are considered unacceptably vulnerable, a lesson written in the burnt-out hulks of Shermans and T-34s in Berlin, Normandy, and hundreds of other battlefields where Panzerfausts exacted their price. Urban warfare doctrine evolved directly from the Panzerfaust experience. Modern military operations in urban terrain manuals emphasize clearing buildings systematically, maintaining standoff distances, and using infantry to suppress anti-tank positions before committing armour. The battles of Grozny, Fallujah, and Mosul all featured defenders using descendants of the Panzerfaust against attacking armour. The tactics employed by attacking forces to counter these weapons trace directly to lessons learned in 1944 and 1945. The Panzerfaust also influenced insurgent and guerrilla warfare tactics. The weapon's simplicity made it ideal for non-state actors and irregular forces. The Vietnamese Viet Cong used captured and Soviet-supplied anti-tank weapons based on Panzerfaust principles against American armour. Afghan Mujahideen used RPG-7s against Soviet tanks in the 1980s. Somali militiamen used RPGs against American helicopters in Mogadishu in 1993. The conceptual lineage runs directly from Leipzig in 1942 to conflicts worldwide today. The economics of the Panzerfaust established another precedent that influences military procurement today. The weapon demonstrated that relatively unsophisticated systems, produced in enormous quantities, could contest highly sophisticated, expensive systems. This asymmetric cost equation favours the defender. A modern RPG-7 costs roughly $500. A Javelin missile costs $80,000. An M1 Abrams tank costs $9 million. The mathematics favour the anti-tank weapon, just as they did in 1945. This cost asymmetry has driven doctrinal changes in how modern militaries think about armour. Tanks are no longer considered invulnerable breakthrough weapons, but rather supporting arms that must operate within integrated combined arms teams. The confidence of World War II-era tankers, who saw their vehicles as armoured fortresses, has been replaced by realistic appreciation of vulnerability. Modern armour crews are acutely aware that any enemy soldier within a few hundred metres with the right weapon can kill them. This awareness shapes everything from tactical movement to psychological readiness. The Panzerfaust's legacy appears in unexpected places. The weapon appears in countless films and video games about World War II, usually portrayed as the weapon of desperate defenders in war's final days. This cultural presence has made the Panzerfaust one of the most recognisable weapons of the war, more famous than many technically superior systems that saw more extensive use. The image of a German soldier, often elderly or young, clutching a Panzerfaust amid ruins has become iconic shorthand for the Nazi regime's final collapse. This cultural memory sometimes obscures the weapon's actual historical impact. The Panzerfaust was neither a wonder weapon that nearly changed the war's outcome nor an ineffective desperation measure. It was a competent anti-tank weapon that gave German infantry a capability they desperately needed, deployed too late and in insufficient quantities to change strategic outcomes, but effectively enough to complicate Allied operations and extend the war's duration marginally. That marginal extension had real costs. Every week the war continued meant more deaths in concentration camps, more civilians killed in bombing raids, more soldiers dying on all sides. If Panzerfaust delayed Allied advances by even a few days collectively, that represents thousands of additional deaths that might have been prevented by earlier German defeat. This is the weapon's darkest legacy. Not the tanks it destroyed, or the soldiers it killed in combat, but its role in prolonging a war whose outcome was already determined. The question of whether the massive resources devoted to Panzerfaust production might have been better used elsewhere is counterfactual speculation, but worth considering. 8 million Panzerfausts represented enormous quantities of steel, explosives, and labour. Could those resources have produced more ammunition for conventional weapons, more spare parts to keep existing vehicles operational, more food for civilians to prevent the starvation that afflicted Germany in the war's final months? The answer is obviously yes, but such allocation would have required admitting the war was lost, something Nazi leadership refused to do until Berlin was in ruins. Dr. Heinrich Langweiler survived the war and continued working in weapons design during the Federal Republic's rearmament in the 1950s. He rarely spoke publicly about the Panzerfaust, perhaps aware of the ethical complexities surrounding his creation. In one of his few recorded comments given in a 1967 interview, he stated simply that he had been given a military requirement and fulfilled it to the best of his ability. Whether the weapon should have been built, whether it should have been used the way it was, those were political and moral questions outside his expertise as an engineer. This technocratic defence is common among weapons designers, but ultimately unsatisfying. Langweiler designed a weapon he knew would be used by inadequately trained soldiers in desperate circumstances. He knew that its one-shot limitation meant users would often die in the act of employment. He knew that its simplicity meant it would inevitably end up in the hands of child soldiers and elderly militia. Did he bear responsibility for those outcomes? The question has no easy answer, and Langweiler took whatever thoughts he had to his grave. What is certain is that the Panzerfaust achieved exactly what it was designed to do. It gave German infantry the capability to destroy Allied tanks using a weapon simple enough for mass production and mass employment. It forced Allied armies to adapt their tactics, to advance more cautiously, to pay a higher price for every kilometre of German territory occupied. It turned every German soldier, regardless of training or capability, into a potential tank killer. These were the requirements given to Langweiler in 1942. He fulfilled them completely. The Allied tankers who faced Panzerfausts, who survived the war and lived into old age, carried memories of the weapon that never faded. In reunions and interviews, when asked about their experiences, many would eventually mention the Panzerfaust, the fear it induced, the constant vigilance it required, the friends they lost to ambushes they never saw coming. Some spoke with anger, others with grudging respect for a well-designed weapon, none spoke with indifference. The Panzerfaust left marks on those who faced it that time never fully erased. Soviet veterans expressed similar sentiments, though often in harsher terms. The Panzerfaust represented to them the last desperate violence of fascism, the Nazi regime's willingness to sacrifice its own population in a futile attempt to delay justice. That elderly men and children were armed with these weapons, and sent to die in Berlin's ruins confirmed Soviet soldiers' belief that they were fighting an evil that had to be eradicated completely. The Panzerfaust became, in Soviet memory, a symbol of fascist desperation and barbarity. The weapon's technical specifications became known to most combatants through bitter experience. Tankers learned the Panzerfaust's range and adjusted their tactics accordingly. They learned to watch for the distinctive backblast signature that revealed firing positions. They learned which parts of their tanks were most vulnerable and tried to position accordingly. They learned that rubble and ruins were death traps to be avoided, or approached only with overwhelming infantry support. These tactical adaptations meant that Panzerfaust effectiveness declined as the war progressed, and Allied forces developed countermeasures. Early encounters, when Allied forces were unfamiliar with the weapon, saw much higher kill rates than later engagements when proper precautions were taken. This pattern has repeated in every conflict since. New weapons are most effective when enemies are unprepared. Once countermeasures develop, effectiveness degrades unless the weapon itself evolves. The Panzerfaust 150, which entered production too late to see significant combat use, represented that evolution. Its extended range would have forced another round of tactical adaptations from Allied forces. Its reusable launch tube would have improved logistics and allowed users multiple shots. Its improved sights and streamlined warhead would have increased hit probability. Had this variant entered service in 1944 instead of 1945, it might have been significantly more effective. But by late 1945, German industry was too disrupted, and Allied victory too certain for improved weapons to matter. The final Panzerfausts were expended in Berlin in late April and early May 1945, in fighting that had long since passed the point of military rationality. German soldiers fired them at Soviet tanks in defense of positions that had no strategic value. Hitler Youth members died attempting to ambush Soviet armour in defense of a regime that had sent them to their deaths. The weapons that remained when the shooting stopped were collected by Soviet forces, studied, copied, and eventually distributed to Warsaw Pact nations and Soviet client states worldwide. This post-war proliferation meant that weapons built in Germany in 1944 were still seeing combat use in the 1960s and 1970s. Egyptian forces used captured German Panzerfausts during the 1956 Suez Crisis. Some examples appeared in Vietnam. The weapon designed for desperate defense in 1943 became a global infantry anti-tank standard, its influence extending far beyond the European battlefields where it was born. Today, examples of Panzerfausts reside in military museums worldwide. These rusted tubes represent more than just technological history. They embody a moment when infantry anti-tank warfare was revolutionized, when the balance between armor and anti-armor shifted decisively, when the cost equation of warfare was fundamentally altered, when it was proven that simple weapons, properly designed and produced in sufficient quantity, could contest the most sophisticated and expensive military systems. The Panzerfaust turned Allied armour into burning wrecks across Europe from 1943 to 1945, destroyed thousands of tanks, killed countless crews, and forced tactical changes that persist in military doctrine to this day. It was a weapon born of desperation, fielded in catastrophic circumstances, used by soldiers who often died in its employment. It couldn't save Germany. Nothing could by the time it entered service. But it demonstrated principles that would shape warfare for generations, that single soldiers could destroy tanks, that simple beat complex when produced in sufficient quantity, that desperate innovation could achieve tactical success even in strategic defeat. These lessons, purchased at terrible cost in Berlin's ruins, Normandy's hedgerows and countless other battlefields, ensure that the Panzerfaust's influence extends far beyond the war that created it.